Nobody prepares you for the deep loneliness that can be found inside of marriage. I think most Christians look towards marriage thinking, that's when I'm going to feel loved. That's when I'm going to feel full. That's when I'm going to feel complete and whole. And nobody prepares you for deep misunderstandings. Nobody prepares you for that moment that you feel deeply alone and you're lying right next to someone that's supposed to love you so deeply. No one prepares you for the moment when you feel like you're explaining yourself over and over and over and it still doesn't land. They still can't understand what you're saying. Even worse, they're thinking you're saying the opposite. They're now even mad at you or accusing you, and you're just trying to feel understood. And then we start wondering, am I stuck like this forever? Is it always going to be like this? Did I marry the wrong person? Does God want me to be in perpetual pain? So maybe we shut down. Maybe we give up emotionally. Maybe we just feel blamed and we want to hide, or we get angry and resentful. The truth is that we feel unseen. I had huge breakthrough and clarity in my marriage when I learned about the lens through which I was accidentally viewing my spouse. And once I saw it, it was so helpful. But before I talk about that, let's just talk about how our childhood can't help but impact the way that we function and do life. And we still carry those cycles with us today. You know, when I was young, I don't know about you, but I didn't feel deeply emotionally cared for in my home. I felt like that really my emotions were kind of a burden. I was an extrovert that lived in a house full of introverts. And when that happens, when everyone around you just wants to be alone and you just want interaction, it feels like abandonment. It feels like being alone. And even worse, because I was the intense kind of charged one that was very direct and everyone else was avoidant and passive, I became the bad sheep. I became the scapegoat, the one that everyone blamed, and collectively continually felt like that I was the bad guy and I was broken and there was something wrong with me. And when you carry a wound like that, where you just ultimately think that you're the problem and that you're a bad person, you come up with ways to cope. And my way to cope was, if I could just explain to you enough, then you'll understand where I'm coming from. And if you understand me, then you'll know that my heart isn't bad. And if you know that my heart isn't bad, then you won't leave me or abandon me. But the truth is that when we over-explain, it breeds more misunderstanding. Because what happens is that the other person feels attacked. They feel overwhelmed. And so the only thing that they can latch a hold on to is your details and correcting your details and saying, well, technically, no, that's not this and this wasn't that, which then makes you feel more invalidated and more misunderstood and more accused. And this was the cycle that I grew up in and I carried into my marriage. I'm going to teach you about the different types of patterns that we usually pick up in the different types of people. But before we do, I want to give you an example so you can really understand using my own marriage cycle. My husband's cycle is quite opposite. You know, growing up in a house with very angry parents that were very loud, he learned to manage other people's emotions through hiding, through being out of sight, through going and pretending and playing outside, and by walking on eggshells. And he learned that fights equal danger, equal rejection. And so avoid confrontation at all cost. He had a higher need for no conflict than he did for resolution. And I have a higher need for resolution so that I feel connection than I do for having a conflict. And so we were literally wired in opposite ways. And this is common in so many marriages. The very way that I feel most understood through resolution leads me to more and more intensity whenever I'm not getting that resolution, was the very thing that he was trying to desperately avoid because he couldn't handle the intensity. And then the very thing that he deeply wanted, which was peace, which was no conflict, no argument, was actually being escalated by his inability to come to the table and to work through things. And so we were perpetuating our own cycles of dysfunction and fear and sadness and abandonment with each other. I had no idea that the current pain that I was experiencing was actually coming from a much deeper place, and I could actually get those wounds healed with God. But before I talk about that, let's just talk about how there's different types of people, that there's different patterns and ways that we learn to function based on what we've gone through. We could have gone through the same thing, but our response is different. And because our response is different, the outcome of our lives becomes different. And I'm going to go over those types because you are a certain type and your spouses are a certain type. And depending on how you got married, like which pattern you married, depends on what your fight cycles and loops look like. I'm going to briefly cover these before we talk about the patterns that they cause, what God showed me, and how to break out of these cycles. So your first type of person is the fighter. These are the ones that are spicy, that are intense, that have a strong need for resolution. Growing up, they learned that if they didn't stand up for themselves, nobody else was going to. if they didn't speak, then they're going to be blamed. They're going to be accused of being wrong, and that they're going to be the only ones that have to clear their name. Deep down, they feel like that they have to deeply explain themselves to not be labeled as bad or wrong. This creates a flood of intense emotions that makes you feel like that I have to be heard. You have to understand me. Underneath that is a strong need to feel seen, to feel known, to feel understood, to not feel like the bad guy. Then we have our flight type of people. And these are our like avoidant types. They rather just go along to get along. They learn that if they just ignore the problem, pretend like it's not there, then it won't be intense and it won't end in rupture. They learned that intensity is very hard, that it overwhelms them, and that they just need to kind of figure out coping mechanisms in order to avoid that. It might be hyper positivity, like pretending like it's not there. It might be spiritualizing it and just declaring truth and putting positivity and faith on top of it. It might just be leaving the room or walking away or not ever bringing it back up again. But these things end up perpetuating the disconnection and actually breed the very thing that they don't want it to. Just like the fighters are breeding disconnection and misunderstanding, which is the very thing that they don't want. Then we have our freezers. These are our shy people. These are our people that are completely shut down, that feel like that my voice doesn't matter. My only option is to hide. They feel so powerless and so overwhelmed that they just go into themselves. They don't engage. They might not even avoid, they just literally stop. They shut down. They won't share anything that they believe or that they think. If they put themselves out there at all, they feel like it's at risk of being completely smashed. Deep down, they don't think that they matter. They don't think their voice matters. They feel completely powerless. And the problem is that in this powerlessness, in this believing that they have no voice, they won't have a voice because they refuse to step out in faith and to try to set boundaries, to try and name things, to try and give feedback to other people that are harming them. Their only tool is to hide. And in that, there's no coming out of that cycle. There's no power. There's no overcoming. And then we have our fawners. Our fawners are our people pleasers. They're the ones that are working hard to regulate everyone else's emotions. If they see someone sad, they take it as their personal responsibility to fix that sadness. Or if they see someone overwhelmed, they take it as their personal responsibility to fix that overwhelm. The problem is that they're piling more and more and more and more on themselves, which is crippling their nervous system. And at some point they become dysregulated. They can no longer function. And really they're driven by a deep need of other people's view of them to be good and positive. They can't stand not being understood. And the way that they help other people understand them is being hyper kind, hyper accommodating. And what ends up happening is that sometimes they remove the other person's responsibility for their actions. And because that person doesn't have to deal with the consequences of their actions, they never have to address their actions or behaviors, or even more so, they don't have to go into what's driving those and what's behind those with God, because they get their cake and eat it too, because this other person is taking all the time to bake and decorate their cake, and they get to sit down and eat it, even though that they tend to do destructive things. Or maybe they just themselves need their own boundaries and they don't have to learn boundaries because they have someone else rescuing them. And so the people pleaser themselves wants to be deeply appreciated and loved and cared for. But what ends up happening is there ends up being resentment and overwhelm. And then last and not least, we have our oscillators. They oscillate between different types of these strategies. They might at one point be very intense and demanding. And then when the other person withdraws, they might be very pleasing and accommodating. They might in some circumstances just shut down and withdraw and just think this isn't safe. I can't deal with this. And then at other times, they might be avoidant and they might just try and pretend like nothing's going on. But then whenever there's no resolution, they go back into intensity again. And so they oscillate between these different things. And I'm actually an oscillator. And so depending on what you are is depending on your reaction, and your reaction fuels and triggers your spouse's reactions in a way that brings out their childhood wounds and trauma. Here's the good news, is that God can heal these things. You know, modern psychology has learned a lot about this, but it doesn't teach you how to deeply heal. It teaches you how to cope with different strategies, to have boundaries, to have language, and those things are super important. And I completely value those things. But the deeper thing that also needs to accommodate those things is healing our wounds with God. Before I tell you how to heal those wounds with God, I just want to give you an analogy. It's like that we're all these big chunky rocks. And whenever you have big chunky rocks and you put them in a river, what happens? They bang against each other. And as they bang against each other, it knocks off the pointy parts of the rocks until you have smooth river stones. And these smooth river stones would have never become this smooth without banging against the other rocks. Well, in this scenario, we're the big chunky rock, life is the river, and our spouse is the other rock that keeps knocking against us. Of course, they're the ones living in closest proximity to us. And so, of course, they're going to be the ones banging against us. It doesn't matter if you replace it with any other rock, any other person, any other spouse, you are going to get banged against. Now, it might not be in the same ways. It might not be in the same spot. Maybe there's certain things that are more jagged on them that are more painful on you. But the good news is that you didn't choose the wrong spouse. Whichever spouse you choose will bang up against you in different pain points in different ways. You just might choose different strategies to respond. And here's the freeing part. When we can realize what is our part, what is our point on the rock, then we can heal that and smooth that over, and then that will never be banged against another rock again. The invitation isn't just strategies to avoid getting the points knocked off of our rocks. The invitation is to actually becoming smooth, actually becoming rollable in his hands. I used to go to Bible college, and the head pastor used to say, "Blessed are the flexible, they shall not break." And I used to hate that because I wasn't flexible and I was very rigid. But the truth is that when we can be smooth like Jesus, one of the life-changing verses that I ever learned was in James, when it talks about wisdom from above is pure, peaceable, gentle, and willing to yield. And that willing to yield really got me. But that's a reflection of Jesus. He didn't try and explain to people. He didn't try and really get them to understand. He allowed himself to be misunderstood. And in that allowing to be misunderstood, he was choosing to trust God's ability to write the narrative. And it might not ever be right. There's people that died believing that Jesus was a heretic. Ultimately, the only thing that matters is what God believes about us. And so being able to be that river rock that's okay with life, that's okay with misunderstandings, that still values connection and values resolution, but isn't coming from an emotionally charged place is the invitation. I'm not completely there yet, but I'm trying and I'm looking and I'm finding those jagged things. And I think the more that we do it, and it's probably like a lifelong thing, probably the older we get and the more we do this, just the more smoother that we get, but is realizing that these things that are painful that we're going through, these rejections, this loneliness, these misunderstandings are really invitations into a deeper place of healing and unity with the Lord, into a deeper place of understanding what Jesus was like and why. And those things are what are going to really make a difference in our marriage, that as we each individually find our wholeness in him, it changes our strategy because it changes the underlying emotional current that's being carried and perpetuating that cycle or strategy. So let's talk about what we can actually do that will help start relieving some of these places. Number one, we can start noticing. We can start noticing times that we are emotionally charged that kind of are bigger than the situation. And then we can sit down with God and we can go into an invitation of, okay, God, what was that? What was behind that? What was really going on? It wasn't about what was said. It was about how I felt rejected or I felt misunderstood, And so that stopping and noticing and exploring with God is step number one. And then number two would be finding the roots of that. If we take a tree and we just snip off any branches that look like they have disease, they can grow back with more disease. It doesn't necessarily get rid of the disease, especially if something is happening in the core of the tree. But if we deal with the tree trunk and the roots and it's whole and it's healed from the fullness of everything, you could chop every single branch off and new branches will grow with good fruit, with good branches, with good leaves. And so us just trying to modify our behavior is just us trying with our white knuckle power to be able to overcome. And God gave us something more than that. He actually offered himself an intimacy with himself in a place of deep healing. And that happens from a place of understanding. And so as we find those triggers and we explore those with God, we explore the roots. We say, Lord, where did I learn this? Where did I learn abandonment? Where did I learn this fear of being misunderstood? And as we explore those things, then we invite God into it. God, what do you have to say? God, what's the truth? What's the perspective that I need to change? If you want help with this, I created a PDF that will help you figure out exactly what your cycles, your triggers, your growth points, your core problems, and the places where you really need to connect with God in the link below. I hope this insight and these tools can really help you in your marriage to be able to see the problems and see that you didn't choose the wrong one, that God doesn't want you to be lonely, but there is some work to do on the inside of you. And as you do that work, even if just one spouse does it, it's going to change the dynamic. It's going to change the pattern. It's going to change the reactions, and it can get better. You can be more understood. There's healing currently happening in my marriage because there's growth in these places. And I know that there's hope for you too.